Most recently, his work has been part of the Abuse and Care Royal Commission of Inquiry. After Oliver's spoken, Tila Moose from the University's Institute of Criminology is going to respond, and then there'll be time for questions. So over to you, Oliver. Hang on.
Tēnā tātou katoa. Tēnā koe, Jerry. Tēnā koe mō tō karakia i tēnei pō. Koutou katoa, he pai rawa atu ki te huihui mai nei i tēnei pō. So thanks to Jerry for the karakia, to Philip for introducing me, and to you all for coming along. It's good to have this opportunity just to share some thoughts and some facts and figures that I haven't made public before, although some of it is in the material that's in the in my book, and I've presented some of it to the Royal Commission. But I should start at the beginning by saying that this is not our family's first brush with the Wellington Fabians. Back in 1934, when George Bernard Shaw was en route to New Zealand, my father, Ivan Sutherland, and one or two of his left-wing colleagues, Bill Such, John Beaglehole, and the politician Peter Fraser, they hastily formed a Wellington branch of the Fabian Society so that they could welcome George Bernard Shaw when he arrived and look after him. At the same time, a student of my father's, Nancy Webber, who later became my mother, thought she'd put on a student party for George Bernard Shaw, and so she wrote him a note inviting him to her flat and to have us join them for a student's party. Shaw's reply was both firm and characteristically witty. He said, "Dear Miss Webber, my broadcast is to be at 10 p.m. When it's finished, I shall hasten to my ship and go straight to bed. It's very kind of you to plan a night for me on the assumption that I'm 28 instead of 78. But you've been quite misinformed on that point. Many thanks all the same." At any rate, he did give a lecture to the Wellington Fabians. But much more recently, in 1972, together with three colleagues in what we call the Nelson Race Relations Action Group, John Hippolyte, Ross Galbraith and Anne Smith, I wrote a paper which was entitled Justice and Race, a Monocultural System in a Multicultural Society. It drew on a recently coined definition of institutional racism proposed by an American, Daniel Critchbaum, in 1973. And Critchbaum wrote, "Racism exists when one group views its cultural values, its lifestyles, and its economic self-interests as being superior to other groups, and then, overtly or covertly, implements these assumptions through societal norms and institutions." The first sentence of our paper, Justice and Race, read, "Together with venereal disease and measles, the judicial system of New Zealand was brought to this country by Pākehā colonists." And actually, I'll read the second sentence. I've got it with me. Actually, it's an original copy of Justice and Race on foolscap, which is something that I had to try and explain to somebody the other day what foolscap was. But the second sentence says, "In common with every other similarly transplanted institution, the judicial system was introduced to this multiracial society with no effort made towards modifying it to suit the needs, the mores, and the cultural values of all the people it was to serve." So, once public, that statement this was 1972. Well, that statement shocked the politicians, the judiciary and the legal fraternity, because they found it universally intemperate and deeply offensive. But it did strike a chord in some Māori and left-wing circles, and the paper was reprinted in full in the Law Journal in 1973, PSA Journal, and the Students' Journal Salient, which was at the time being edited by Roger Steele, who more recently has published my book. So today I want to tell you what led up to the publication, Justice and Race, what it concluded, and then what it led to. But first I need to start with a bit of background. After 4 years as a zoology student at Canterbury University, I left home in 1965 to undertake a PhD at Cambridge. And 3 peaceful years in Cambridge, probably best characterised by the Beatles album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Heart Club Band, which was very popular at the time. And then in 1968, after marrying Ulla, we left the gentle peace of punting down the Cam for a year's postdoctoral research at the University of California in Berkeley, just over the bridge from San Francisco. It was late 1968. Already Robert Kennedy had been assassinated in June of that year, Martin Luther King in April of that year. And as our flight paused briefly in Chicago en route to San Francisco, we might have heard the din of the violently riotous Chicago Democratic Convention, which was happening at the time. But we carried on to Berkeley, and on our first night in Berkeley in our apartment, the building that enjoyed the apartment block, the Reserve Officers Training Corps, was bombed. And it turned out that Berkeley was rioting too. And for the next year, the university campus was in turmoil. The National Guards, brandishing rifles with fixed bayonets, lined the streets. The Governor of California, who at the time was Ronald Reagan, ordered the campus to be bombed from the air with tear gas. All to the backdrop this time, far from the Beatles, but rather the edgy Me and Bobby McGee from Janis Joplin and Strange Fruit from Nina Simone. We were about as far as we could have been from Cambridge. On campus, between protest marches against the Vietnam War or against racism or against the oppressive police and military tactics, I listened to regular speeches by Bobby Seale, by Eldridge Cleaver, Huey Newton of the Black Panthers, and I read Cleaver's book Soul on Ice, which was written when he was in Folsom Prison and was published just as we arrived in Berkeley. And these got me thinking deeply for the first time about what we called race relations in New Zealand. And I started viewing New Zealand society in the light of what I was witnessing and experiencing in the United States. At the end of '69, after 4 years away, Ulla and I left Berkeley and settled in Nelson, where I had a position as an entomologist with the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research. And in no time I was invited by a relation of mine, trade unionist and activist John Hippolyte, to become the secretary of the Nelson Māori Committee, which I did at the end of 1969. John was the chairman. From time to time, we assisted young Māori who were in trouble with the police or the children's court, and we soon saw the many disadvantages that children faced in their dealings with the whole judicial system. And we decided to look at the national picture and began really what was a 15-year analysis of racism of the judicial system with a particular focus on children and the children's courts. The first step along the judicial pathway is really whether or not the police decide to prosecute a child. And we found that, that this had already been investigated by a departmental research officer, Ross Hampton, who had analysed thousands of police youth aid cases and found that regardless of other factors, police discriminated against Māori boys by sending a disproportionate number of them to court, inflating their crime rate in comparison with non-Māori boys. So discrimination was happening even before the children got into court at the decision of the police decision to prosecute. We then analysed the children's court data from the national statistics for 5 years from 67 to 71. And the picture that emerged, particularly for Māori children, really shocked us. We found that, for a start, in every year between 10,000 and 11,000 children were being, from the ages of 7 upwards, were taken before the children's court throughout the country. And 40 to 50% of them were Māori, huge numbers. because there was no duty solicitor scheme of any sort at the time. None of them, or very few of them, were represented by lawyers. So there were young children facing criminal charges, and in those days, we saw in the statistics 7 and 8 and 9-year-olds charged with burglary offences against the person, or offences against the person in conversion, and the figures included 10 and 11-year-olds being charged with assault, if they weren't being charged with being idle and disorderly or a rogue and a vagabond. And the statistics showed that each year there were children who were charged with those offences. And as I've said, they were often in most cases questioned alone in the presence of by the police, often without a parent, and certainly never with a lawyer. Most pleaded guilty, as the police told them to, or as a social welfare officer told them to. And because parents were not present, in many cases, because the children were already state wards, and the social welfare didn't take any steps to get them lawyers. So there was no one there to help them decide whether to plead guilty or not, plead in mitigation, get bail for them, and so on. The statistics showed that the outcome of these children's courts throughout the country were particularly disastrous for Māori children. They were twice as likely to be sentenced to a penal institution. That would be a detention centre or a borstal or prison, whereas non-Māori children were more likely to be fined or admonished and discharged. So our conclusion was that the figures proved that the children's courts were discriminating against Māori children, and we wrote in '72 to the Minister of Justice, at the time Sir Roy Jack, and later to the Labour Minister Martin Finlay, saying so. The government's own statistics had proved that it was a racist system. Well, Sir Roy Jack wrote back and he replied that in New Zealand we had the best of British justice for all, which of course was exactly what we had said. Martin Finlay was a bit more aware, I think, and a little bit more understanding, and he did have the grace to say that the record of the Children's Court was a dismal one. But with nobody there to argue for bail, if it wasn't granted, magistrates might remand children to social welfare homes, which we'll talk about later. But if they were non-existent, which they were in Nelson, then the children who were remanded in custody could only be held in the cells of the local police station, which had no facilities for children and which left the children open to approach or abuse by adult prisoners at the same time. In 3 or 4 of the bigger centres, such as Auckland and Christchurch and Wellington and Christchurch, children from the age of 13 would be remanded to an adult prison, to the remand cells of an adult prison, including the dungeons of Mount Eden or Mount Crawford. In the case of Mount Eden, it was about an average of 150 children a year. These adult remand cells, which were often shared with an older prisoner, had no separate facilities at Mount Eden or Mount Crawford, no plumbing, just a plastic bucket in the corner for the toilet that you shared with another older man usually. And these are boys from the age of 13 upwards. A Justice Department study at the time showed that in the magistrates' courts, twice as many non-Māori offenders had lawyers as did Māori, 86% Pākehā, 44% Māori. So it showed that not only were Māori much less well represented, the figures also showed that they tended to plead guilty more often, which is not that surprising if you don't have a lawyer. And the author then, Mary Shoemaker, who worked for the Justice Department, concluded with a greater proportion of Māori pleading guilty and fewer having representation, there is, of course, a greater likelihood of Māori being convicted. So again, I'm building up the picture of how the numbers increase and increase in each of these processes of the judicial system. So having reviewed and publicised all these statistics, and having loudly criticised the Justice Department for the racism of those statistics, we decided that the most practical thing that we could do in Nelson was to set up our own legal aid scheme, our own do-it-yourself duty solicitor scheme. So in 1972, we aimed to get every Māori in Pacifica who was appearing before the Nelson courts to get a lawyer for them. So we had to get a couple of lawyers, at least, and there were two lawyers, Warwick Reid and Brian Smythe, who offered to do this work for us. And we got the agreement of the Nelson Superintendent of the Police to let us, or to tell us, when there were any Māori or Pacific arrested. We would visit them and we would arrange a lawyer for them and get them bail if we could, but at least represent them in court. So we ran that scheme for all of 1972. And then what we called the Nelson Race Relations Action Group, the four of us who wrote this paper, with the agreement of the Nelson Court Registrar, we were given the index cards for all defendants in the Nelson courts for a 3-year period, 70 and 71, which were the years before our scheme started, and 72, which was the year of our scheme. And so we wanted to do a statistical comparison between 2 years before and then the actual year 72 of our scheme. And I should say the magistrate was the same throughout, so that we got sort of continuity of that factor. Well, there were 14,000 files in all, and we set aside the traffic cases. And then for the remaining criminal cases, we tabulated the data on ethnicity, the charges faced, the outcome, and whether or not the defendant had been represented. And the results were really striking. In 70 and 71, about 18% of Māori defendants had lawyers. In 72, which was the year of our scheme, 79%. And a comparison to the pleas, conviction rates, penalties showed marked differences. In 72, there was a significant increase in the number of not guilty pleas. I mean, none of this is surprising, but we had to show it with the facts and figures, and we had the access to the data. And for the first time in the survey period, there were cases against Māori defendants were actually dismissed. None of them had been in 70 or 71. Imprisonments were down by a third, and the rate of imprisonment was actually lower for Māori than it was for Pākehā at the time, first for New Zealand. And sentences to probation were even more drastically reduced, from 17% in 70-71 to 5%. And there was a corresponding rise, of course, in the proportion of Māori who were fined or who were admonished and discharged. So, of course, we concluded, and you'll see why we did that. If representation by lawyers had a similar effect in sentencing in courts elsewhere in New Zealand, as it did in Nelson, there would be major differences in the imprisonment rate particularly and the severity of the sentencing for Māori defendants. So those were the results that we included in the paper Justice and Race, a Monocultural System in a Multicultural Society. And we presented those results in a paper to the Race Relations Council at the beginning of 1973. And that proved, we believed, the institutional racism of the judicial system at the time. But it was an accusation that upset the politicians and the judiciary so greatly. Now, at the same time as we were running that legal aid scheme, we decided we'd have a look at who was running the system. And so we wanted to have a look at the proportion of Māori at the various sort of sectors of the judicial system. I mean, the starting point was how many Māori were there coming before the courts? Well, it was about 40%. And in Borstal, prisons in Borstal was up to 60 or 70%. So first of all, we looked at those who were locking them up, prison officers, and we found that 12% of the prison officers were Māori, pretty much the same as in the general population, 12%. But then that's a vocation that didn't carry much status in society and had little power to influence the wider judicial system, so not surprising. It was a very different story in 1972 for the police. In 1972, there were 3,300 members of the police force. Of these, there was no Māori in the 5 ranks above inspector. And in fact, there was just one Māori in the total of 64 inspectors. there were just 3 Māori senior sergeants throughout the country out of 197, 12 sergeants out of 492, and 124 Māori constables out of a total number of constables of 2,487. So the overall percentage of Māori in the police at that stage was 4.2%. Probation officers were no better, just 4% were Māori. The figures for justices of the peace was even worse, 2.5%, and they are positions where you didn't have to have a law degree to be appointed a JP, and in fact the politicians did the appointment, but they still were not appointing Māori. And lastly, if we looked at the 46 magistrates throughout the country, there was just one, Ken Mason in South Auckland, and he had just been appointed the year before we did our survey in 1971. And of course there were no Māori Supreme Court judges. So our interpretation of all this data as evidence of institutional racism, it drew heavily on what I had learnt when I took part in a World Council of Churches delegation that went to the United States at the end of 72. And it was about the time when I came back when we wrote that. And I went to the States with, you might know these names, Reverend Don Borry, Reverend John Grundy, David Cuthbert, a student leader, and me. There were 4 of us, sort of liberal Pākehā. And the World Council of Churches paid for us to travel to Detroit and to Oakland to learn from those in the States who were in the sort of vanguard of anti-racism thinking in the United States. And it was they who schooled us in the concepts of institutional racism and the role and responsibility of whites to challenge and work for change against the racism in racist societies such as the United States, or as I was seeing when I came home, such as in New Zealand. But it wasn't just the politicians and the bureaucrats and the lawyers who were upset by our use of the terms racist and racism. I mean, you've got to realise institutional racism was a term had never been used before. Until we used it in this paper, it wasn't a term that was used. And nor were the whole, to call the use of the terms racism and racist, it upset one of our strongest supporters, which was Sir Guy Poles, who was the first ombudsman and he was the first race relations conciliator. And Sir Guy believed that the terms were inappropriate and they went too far. He thought we should refer to the racial discrimination of the judicial system. He thought that the term racialism was preferable to racism. And there was a debate that went on between him and Tamapuata of the Māori Organisation of Human Rights in the Māori Organisation newsletter for a number of months in 72 and 73. In fact, Sir Guy never did agree. Later, when he retired as race relations conciliator, he wrote to me, and we had many years of correspondence. He was explaining that in his final report as race relations conciliator, he said, quote, "I make, as it were, one dying and perhaps fruitless attempt to criticise the continuing use of the term racist. You and I have corresponded about this before, and I still feel it has such emotive overtones as a sort of term of abuse that its use in a number of cases does more harm than good. It would, he thought, be better and easier to convince Pākehā that they did practice, but they practiced racialism, perhaps without consciously knowing it. And it would be easier if we did to do that and to get them to accept that than to accept that they were white racist." So, to come back to this paper, in the beginning of 1973 we presented to the Race Relations Council in Auckland, arguing and offering proof that the system was a racist system. Now at that conference were Will Iolahia from the Polynesian Panther Party and Sid Jackson from Ngā Tamatoa. And after I had stood up and presented that, and there'd been a bit of dialogue about it, Will got up and said, together with Sid, they challenged me and they challenged all the Pākehā in the room, and the Race Relations Council at that time was mostly a Pākehā organisation. And the challenge which was articulated most uncompromisingly by Will was, well, racism is a white problem. It's up to you Pākehās to do something about it. And it struck home, and I went away, and some of us went away, and a small group of us formed what became the Auckland Committee on Racism and Discrimination, or ACORD. And key founding members of that, and I want to mention their names because ACORD was became quite an influential organisation, but there weren't many of us. There was Ray and Mitzi Nairn, there was Ross Galbraith, Margaret Arthur, Helen Nelson, Chris Lane, Robert and Miriam Ludbrook, Ulla and me, and Philip Tremewan for a time. And from the outset, we were guided and supported by a team of Māori and Pacific consultants, drawn from the ranks of the Auckland District Māori Council, the Māori Women's Welfare League, Ngā Tamatoa and the Polynesian Panthers Samoan Advisory Association. And while none of those groups had any doubt about the racism of New Zealand institutions, we were soon challenged by groups from the left wing of political thinking, who argued that the issue was not one of race, it was one of class and poverty. And that became quite a debate at the time. Prominent amongst those was Wolfie Rosenberg of Canterbury University, and he dismissed Critchbaum's analysis of institutional racism, or definition, I guess, as being involving cultural values. Wolfgang wanted to see evidence proving that race was the determining factor rather than class and the economic situation of the defendants. He wanted us to prove it, though he did agree that the facts and figures that we had in this paper went some way towards proving it. And it struck home to those of us in ACORD that if we were ever going to prove or get an acceptance of the racism in society and recruit others to challenge it, we would need to prove it with facts and figures, which we went about doing. One of ACORD's first campaigns was to carry on the efforts that had started in Nelson for the establishment of a national duty solicitor scheme. And publicity which was given to our paper Justice and Race, particularly its publication in the Law Journal, led to ad hoc groupings of lawyers in different cities around New Zealand starting their own legal aid schemes. But at the same time, the Minister of Justice, Martin Finlay, announced that he had set up a departmental committee to plan a national duty solicitor scheme. And during 1973, to keep up the pressure on the government, I went around the country speaking to 20 or so meetings, including a number of law societies, arguing the case for a national duty solicitor scheme. And one of these was organised by the Auckland District Law Society, which was a group that included Robert Ludbrook, David Longy, Jim McClay and Peter Williams. And Robert had arranged the event, which was held in May 73, and had me facing a well-known and very conservative Auckland magistrate called Hector Gilliand and Ken Flint, who was running social welfare in Auckland at the time. It was my opportunity to present ACORD's blueprint for a comprehensive new approach to child offending, completely outside the monocultural and punitive Victorian system and concept of justice to which the child welfare and judicial systems had for so long been wedded, since 1925. In fact, the present children's court system and all of the penal policy which had been in place since 1925 should be demolished and completely abandoned, we said. It failed by all measures, including equity of outcome, particularly for Māori, as those national statistics for Māori and non-Māori children had showed. It was racist by virtue of its very existence as a wholly Pākehā system in a multicultural society such as New Zealand. Māori and Pākehā should jointly redesign the whole approach to justice and child welfare, but as a short-term measure, at least all children should be accompanied by a lawyer when they were being when they were being questioned by police and in court. Well, things were slowly changing. So the Minister of Justice, Martin Finlay, reflecting Sir Guy Pole's views, acknowledged that there was some substance to the charge that New Zealand's system was racist. But he went on, it was more of an unconscious than a deliberate policy. But he concluded that he was, and there were powerful words, he said that he was beginning to lean towards the notion that separate but equal institutions for the races could have some merit in New Zealand. Now that was 1973. It was an extraordinarily forward-thinking acknowledgement, and warranted an editorial of the Dominion that said at the time Dr. Finlay had moved into a new area for a non-Māori in public affairs. But in any case, the Interdepartmental Committee was moving slowly in producing the blueprint for a national duty solicitor scheme. Too slowly for at least one person who decided to anonymously send a draft document, a draft cabinet paper on the proposal in the mail to me. So we'd been pushing for a duty solicitor scheme for 2 years and made all these submissions and had roundly criticised the ministers responsible, really getting under, I suppose, Labour Minister, particularly Martin Finlay's skin. Well, obviously we were very interested to read what was in the leaked cabinet paper and see what the government had in mind, and we weren't actually very impressed with it. And we wrote to Finlay to say so, pointing out that unless some key changes were made, we would make the whole thing public. Of course, Finlay was absolutely incensed and demanded that we return the paper and reveal who'd leaked it to us, or else he would hand over the matter to the police for investigation under the Official Secrets Act. We weren't about to comply with either of his requests and told him so. Actually, although we should have done so, we didn't at the time look and see just what the provisions of the Official Secrets Act were, but we found out soon enough. In fact, on the 14th of May 1974, Dr. Finlay passed the correspondence between himself and me to the Minister of Police, who was Mick Connolly. This was the Kirk government, under a memorandum calling for urgent action by the police with a view to investigating the whole matter under the Official Secrets Act. Well, the police wasted little time. That was on a Tuesday. On 9 a.m. on the morning of the Saturday, the 18th of May, the head of the Christchurch CIB, Detective and Superintendent Brian Wilkinson, a Detective Inspector from Wellington and another officer arrived at our home in Grey Lynn. I should pause and explain that at this time we were part of a coalition that was running a very strong campaign against a team policing unit called the Task Force that had been established in Auckland by Assistant Commissioner Gideon Tate and Inspector Ross Dallow. And I was the spokesperson for Accord and became well known publicly as we exposed the racist policing by the Task Force of the inner city of Auckland, which had led to several Māori and Pacific Island people being arrested and taken to court on trivial charges. Now, the Commissioner of Police in Wellington, Ken Burnside, who knew of Tate's bitter antipathy towards me personally, was not about to let any of the Auckland police loose in our house, and so called in Brian Wilkinson from Christchurch and the Wellington Police to deal with this, what was now very highly charged and highly political operation. The police had search warrants, and their action under the Official Secrets Act had been authorised by the Solicitor General, Richard Savage, and the Commissioner of Police, Sir Angus Sharp. And while Wilkinson and his team waited on the doorstep, I phoned our lawyer, who was David Longy, and told him that what was going on. He said we should keep the police outside until he arrived, which he did a few minutes later, looking as dishevelled as ever. In fact, like most people, Longy knew nothing about the the provisions of the Official Secrets Act, and had been hastily briefing himself before arriving. But it was passed in 1951, at the time of the strikes at that time, and had been used perhaps once early on in the piece against one person, but had never otherwise been used since in the intervening 20 years. Now, although in those days, every public servant, as I did when I joined DSIR, every public servant in the country had to sign the Official Secrets Act, very few people or lawyers were familiar with its provisions, which conferred immense powers upon the Attorney General and the police. In possession of any government note, scrap of paper, memorandum, let alone cabinet paper, could be used as an excuse to force ordinary citizens to undergo compulsory interrogation and to have their homes searched. So after 3 hours of discussion between Longy and Wilkinson, when Longy explained that the document was not in the house but would be handed over on the Monday, the visit on that Saturday morning ended amicably and the police left. And although Longy didn't tell Wilkinson, Uller and he had deposited the document in a safe deposit box at the Ponsonby branch of the Bank of New Zealand, it wasn't retrievable till the Monday. So, for some reason which was never explained, Wilkinson and the team came back and searched our house in the afternoon anyway and didn't find anything incriminating. But much more seriously, Ulla and I were told that we must attend the Central Police Station at noon on the Monday for an interrogation over the whole event. On the Sunday night, David Longy phoned Martin Finlay to try and persuade him to have the interrogation called off. Finlay said it had gone too far and that he was not able to. The search of our house, which was done, and the impending interrogation were front page news. And it so happened that a meeting of Maori leaders in Auckland was taking place at the time, and telegrams protesting the search of our house were sent by the chairman of the New Zealand Māori Council, Graham Latimer, to the Prime Minister, to Norman Kirk, that is, and to the Ministers of Justice and Māori Affairs, Martin Finlay and Matthew Rata, and to the various opposition politicians, Jack Marshall and Sir Keith Holyoke. But nobody could do anything. We hurriedly familiarised ourselves with the draconian provisions of the Act, particularly that we would face 7 years in prison if we failed to answer any question, or if we answered any question falsely. We would not be permitted to take advice for a lawyer, although Longy was allowed to be there. As an alien, a Swedish citizen, Ulla could be deported. Anyway, on the Monday we were picked up by the police at our home and escorted to the 10th floor of the Auckland City Police Station. It was an intensely intimidating event. I was repeatedly asked about the origin of the cabinet paper and how it came into my hands, and I answered as best I could, but when we tried to discuss a particular point with David, Wilkinson threatened to use Section 11 of the Act against him too. The whole thing was extremely upsetting. We were certain that this heavy-handed action by the government, was provoked by our continuing criticism of the police task force and the crackdown and the discriminatory treatments of Māori children by the police and by the justice and social welfare systems. I mean, my name was anathema to the police and to social welfare and to the Justice Department at the time, and we thought and did believe that this was what was behind the action that the government was taking. Later in the House, the Prime Minister, Norman Kirk, was questioned over it, and he voiced sharp criticisms of me personally. Mick Connolly said, the Minister of Police said, that the search of our house was really for our own benefit, because if they didn't find any papers of a like nature, it would clear me of any allegations of anything else. Of course, there were no other allegations and there were no other papers. The Auckland Council for Civil Liberties took up the cudgels on my behalf, stating that it appeared the government was using the Act to silence its own critics. And the consensus of the media, commentators and editorialists, and there were very many, was that the prosecution of me was unlikely and the government had overreacted in using the Official Secrets Act against us. And there was no prosecution. So having lain unused for 22 years since its enactment in 1951, actually the Official Secrets Act was used twice in 1974, in May against Ulla and me, and then again in September, this time to arrest Dr. Bill Such and charge him with the offence of obtaining information that would be helpful to an enemy, that is, spying. There was huge publicity over the search and the interrogation of Ulla and me, and then there was a blaze of publicity over Such's arrest, and led to invitations to me particularly, Such wasn't well at the time, to address large public rallies against the Act, and it prompted the government in 1977 to establish the Danks Committee, And the Danks Committee then, of course, reviewed the Official Secrets Act. By then, Such had died, and Ulla and I were the only people left alive against whom the Act had been used, and we still are. In 1982, the Official Secrets Act was repealed, and as the Danks Committee had urged, it was replaced by the Official Information Act. So that's where the Official Information Act all started. Meanwhile, Dr. Finley's duty solicitor scheme got underway in July 74, and the proposal which Finley had put to his colleagues and which we had leaked to us, it did guarantee legal advice for defendants but not legal representation, and it fell far short of what we and Ngā Tamatoa had argued over the years. It wouldn't end racial discrimination. It wouldn't end it wouldn't guarantee legal representation for Māori who needed it, and it overlooked the particular needs of Māori and Pacifica children. Ngā Tamatoa said the scheme did nothing to attack the basic problem of institutional racism which continues to exist in the whole of the judicial system and which ensures that Māori remain the jail fodder of this society. And they were absolutely right. But in any case, the scheme was established, and within a few months there were 200 or 300 lawyers throughout the country who had signed up for the scheme. Just looking back in the judicial system, you can ask whether things changed. Well, over that period of time, I mean, duty solicitors are now part of the system. And in 1984, Judge Augusta Wallace did an inquiry into the remanding of children to Mount Eden Prison, which we had been campaigning against for 10 years. And she finally admitted and recommended that children should no longer be remanded to adult prisons. But they are still remanded and can still be remanded in some parts of the country to police cells. So Judge Beecroft has still run a campaign against that, but it still continues. And of course, a disproportionate number of those are Māori. Well, I just want to turn on and really in conclusion, I want to leave the judicial system now and look at how the Department of Social Welfare has dealt with children in its care. Now, in the 1970s, there were 20 boys and girls homes in the country, homes such as Owaraka and Allendale for boys in Auckland and Bollard and Wesleydale in Auckland, Epuni Home in Wellington, Kohitiri, Stanmore Road Girls Home in Christchurch. There were 20 of them, and they handled about 4,000 children a year. Owaraka alone had 1,000 boys every year admitted into it. The children were aged 10 to 17, and up to 70, if not 80%, of them were Māori or Pacific, hugely disproportionate. Now, while abuses occurred in all these homes, there were differences between the boys' homes and the girls' homes. At the boys' homes like Owaraka or Wesleydale, boys could be exercised to exhaustion, beaten with canes, with rubber strops, or beaten with a cricket bat until their buttocks bled. At Wesleydale, there were arranged boxing matches for a boy who ran away. He would be forced to fight another boy until he fell bleeding to the ground. These were set up by the staff. And again at Owaraka, there was a nodding system. There was no speaking aloud, and the staff just nodded to a boy, and then he knew that he had to go out and have a shower, and he nodded again to go back to his cell. At the girls' home, all new, such as Bollard, all new admissions after they'd had their delousing were given an enforced internal VD examination. Girls who protested were strapped and struggled were strapped into stirrups. Access to sanitary products was restricted. So boys' and girls' homes did differ, but they had two common features. Firstly, there was never any attempt to provide at all for the cultural needs of the majority of the children who were there, which were Māori and Pacific. Absolutely nothing. Secondly, all homes had purpose-built cells for solitary confinement, known as secure. In fact, they were concrete bunkers in which each cell with a reinforced window, was totally bare except for a mattress on a metal frame and a toilet pedestal. All meals were taken in the cell, beside the toilet, in which the child spent 23 hours a day. But the thing is, it was departmental policy that all new admissions, after they'd gone through the delousing and given the standard minimal clothing, they would be locked insecure for the first few days or up to a week, boys and girls. But solitary confinement was also used routinely for punishment. For example, for running away, a boy or a girl would be placed insecure for weeks on end. 3 to 4 weeks was common, at the mercy of the staff. Nothing was provided for the child to occupy the time, and at least in Oaxaca, they were not allowed to know what the time was, and they could only judge that from when they were given their meals. While other abuses like sexual abuses were obviously not sanctioned and were inflicted by individual paedophile staff, solitary confinement that I've just been talking about was departmental policy. We said that it was psychological torture. And when we made a complaint to the Human Rights Commission in 1982 and they inquired into it, they said that in fact the practices that were going on in the social welfare homes, including the use of solitary confinement, breached the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and on the rights of the child. And yet for years, solitary confinement was used routinely, and it was denied that they were doing it by the politicians or defended by the bureaucrats that were actually running the homes. One last word about Lake Alice. The horrific use of shocks to treat or punish children from the age of 9 at Lake Alice between 72 and 78 is well known, and I'm not going to go into it here. But you'll have seen that when Philip sent out his notice for this meeting, he included a quote of mine regarding the use of electric shocks to children's bodies at Lake Alice as punishment. And what I said in 1977 was that, quote, if the allegations are proved, this misuse of shock treatment will constitute perhaps the most appalling abuse of children in the guardianship of the state that this country has ever known. Well, the Royal Commission's report on Lake Alice is due to be released in a week or two, and having heard all the testimony myself at the 2-week hearing, I'm absolutely confident that it's going to find that such abuses were proven. Thank you.
Can I have the wireless microphone?
Mm-hmm.
Wireless microphone.
Yep.
Can I have it, please? Let me see if that will work.
T, would you like to come and sit
Sure.
over here?
There you go.
I promise you I'm not going to read all of them. Although,
He can sit on the stool.
You can have a hot seat.
No, no.
oh, thank you. I've been given a very difficult task. I'm trying to respond to the sheer multitude of experiences, of insights that Oliver has shared with us. And I really, on behalf of everyone here, want to thank you, Oliver, for sharing this with us and for all of your work over the last 50
Yeah, it is 50.
50 years. Thank you. There is an English scholar, Phil Scraton, an activist and lawyer, who has been essential in exposing the crime that was committed at Hillsborough Stadium, with police forcing through a tunnel men, women and children who ended up being crushed, and then the subsequent follow-up and denial of the massacre that occurred. And Phil has this concept of bearing witness, and I think it describes Oliver well. Critical analysis emanating from within prisons has the capacity to expose the structural context in which criminal justice is enacted. Relying on the prevailing rhetoric of law, order, and punishment has prevailed over time. Confronted with the reality of being there, of bearing witness, the critical prison researcher, the justice advocate, responds to the fundamental challenge famously posed by Howard Becker to fellow researchers. Whose side are you on? The sides are both conceptual and interventionist, illustrated by the dichotomous relationship between rehabilitation and incapacity care and custody. Critical social research bears witness to systemic abuse, harnesses official discourses from formal inspections, and we've heard from a lot of those inquiries from Oliver today, provides empirical alternative accounts to those carefully orchestrated by prison managers and state departments. It projects the personal troubles of the incarcerated to the wider societal public issues. It bears witness to the stories of people experiencing the worst abuses of our criminal justice system and allows those stories to fundamentally change how it is that we conceptualize our justice system. And I think that describes, Oliver, exactly what your work has done and continues to do, which is allows for stories from those who are directly affected by our racist justice system, by our colonial justice system, to be heard. Throughout the talk, I was thinking a lot about the continuities and discontinuities, what happens and what still happens today. And I am very afraid that actually we run the risk of repeating exactly the forms of institutionalized abuse and dehumanization that Oliver worked so hard to expose. In terms of discontinuities, because of Oliver and others' work, we have duty solicitors, and that is fundamentally important. I would suggest, though, that if you haven't, that you spend a day in your local district court. It is one of the most profound ways in which you can understand class and race in this country and the fundamental operation of our racist justice system. Because if nothing else, you will see that there is one class and racial group who are the lawyers and the decision makers, and another class and racial group who are being processed through the system. Early last year, I sat through a series of hearings following the Waikeria prison uprising and in the Hamilton District Court. And there was a man there, there was a lawyer speaking on behalf of a self-representing prisoner who was in solitary confinement at Spring Hill Prison at the time. He was requesting access to legal documents that would enable him to prepare his case and was being held in solitary confinement. Corrections refused to give him this information. The entire process of the lawyer bringing up the issue and the magistrate responding wouldn't have been more than 30 seconds. And the magistrate simply said, "I'm not dealing with this." And then that person was expected to then wait for another 8 weeks before the next hearing in solitary confinement, unable to in any way prepare their case. And so I'm pointing to this important discontinuity, that we do have this representation, but these problems remain. We also have tikanga Māori programs in our prisons, which, from what I've heard from prisoners, can help people to find themselves, and they can be profoundly important, while also not doing anything to fundamentally reshape and challenge the Pākehā nature of our justice system. We also have a profoundly more diverse police force. And, unfortunately, studies overseas have demonstrated, and actually here as well, that unfortunately Māori experiences, or in the United States, black people's experiences of police officers tends to actually be no different, depending whether or not they are black, right? That simple diversity, representation within the police force is not enough to challenge these colonial structures. And I think about what's continuing. Oliver's experience of having his house searched. I was lucky enough to see some data from the Drug Foundation a couple of days ago, which shows there are nearly 9,000 warrantless searches conducted by the New Zealand Police every year. Disproportionately Māori who are experiencing these. And in our current moral panic around youth crime, around ram raids, we're also potentially going to see the next government introduce sweeping laws which would extend the power of the police to conduct these warrantless searches. And so in many ways, this continuity really scares me. The experience of fight clubs for children, as punishment for children who escaped Lake Alice, is something that continues in our prisons. Not just at Mount Eden Prison, but I've heard stories from people in prison throughout the estate that fight clubs continue to be organised by corrections officers in order to punish people. The horrible image of children, young women, being tested for venereal disease. That experience of sexual dehumanization, degradation, is an institutionalized practice in our prisons, not for venereal disease testing, but in the form of strip searches. Hundreds of thousands of strip searches occurring every year in our prisons. Institutionalized sexual violence. And then there's solitary confinement. This is something that I care about very deeply, in part because my master's research was about looking into every instance of someone dying in our prisons from 2006 to 2016. And solitary confinement was a really important part of that story. And I did subsequent research on it. The torturous, dehumanizing effects of solitary confinement aren't just about the psychological impacts, which can be permanent, which can induce psychosis, but also physiological. People being unable to sleep, constantly becoming extremely sensitive to light and sound, becoming incredibly irritable, unable to eat. It's a profoundly inhumane practice that we allow to happen in our prisons. And when I released a report in 2018 on solitary confinement in our prisons, the corrections minister at the time, currently Calvin Davis, denied that solitary confinement even exists. This is after, while being in opposition, decrying the fact that a prisoner in Whitty prison had taken their own lives while in solitary confinement. And so we have this institutional denial of
Bert Walker in 73.
Institutional denial that we would, in fact, treat people in this way. But we continue to do. And it continues to be done in our name, despite the profound work that people like Oliver have been doing. And I'm trying to think about how I want to... Judith Butler is a thinker who's profoundly shaped how I conceptualize all of this. And I want to read a series of quotes from her, which I think will help us to see how we can move through this. Whether explicitly stated or not, every political effort to manage populations, which is what our colonial justice system is, involves a tactical distribution of precarity, more often than not articulated through an unequal distribution of precarity. One that depends on dominant norms regarding whose life is grievable and worth protecting, and whose life is ungrievable, or marginally or episodically grievable. And so in that sense, already lost, or in whole, or in part or in whole, and thus less worthy of protection and sustenance. And our justice system is ultimately about the protection of some at the expense of our most marginalised. Continuing. And so Sorry, I got the wrong page. Ungrievable lives are those that cannot be lost and cannot be destroyed because they inhabit a lost and destroyed zone. They are ontologically, from the start, already lost and destroyed, which means that when they are destroyed in war or in systemic abuse, in institutional violence, nothing is destroyed. And so, in terms of how it is that we create a social system in which certain lives are unworthy of dignity, are not given the sustenance in order to survive, based on a colonial system, economic and social system. And then we end up putting people in prison. We end up treating them as if they are not worthy of protection themselves. And what happens, how is it that we deal with the sheer quantity of harm that has been committed in our name? And the State Abuse and Care Royal Commission, I think, fundamentally exposes so much of that. But much of this abuse continues to happen today in our prisons, in our name, for our supposed protection. And so how do we grapple with that harm? It will be the last one. And Judith Butler says, I think that one mourns when one accepts the fact that the loss one undergoes will be one that changes you possibly forever. And that mourning has to do with agreeing to undergo a transformation, the full result of which you cannot know in advance. So there is losing and there's the transformative effect of loss. And this latter cannot be charted or planned. When we have experienced such profound trauma as a society caused by our institutions and our indifference to that institutional abuse, we have to be willing to allow our society, our justice system, to be fundamentally transformed to ensure that this never happens again. And so all I wanted to do was hold up a copy of Mā Teke Mai and the vision for constitutional transformation laid out by Moana Jackson and Margaret Mutu as a possible way forward. How is it that we can stop allowing institutional abuse in our name? So, Oliver, thank you very, very much. And I guess if, to the extent that I have a question is, how is it that you conceptualize us moving beyond this?
Do you want to speak to that?
I think it poses an immense challenge for Pākehā. It's the challenge that we looked at in 1973. It's the challenge of what it means to be white in a oppressive colonialist society. And so how do you reform the systems, which is what you're suggesting? There has to be I suppose it sounds old-fashioned, but there has to be, I think, a bicultural approach. It has to be Māori and Pākehā. But it's got to be a treaty-based approach, and that has to be accepted by the parties before they even embark on working for change in the system. In other words, how does the treaty guide us in terms of, how does it guide us in the reforming and the reforming from the very base upwards of our institutions? It's a huge question, and I probably haven't answered it very well. It's something that I think some politicians have struggled to deal with Martin Finley when he said back in 1973 or 74 that he thought that there was a case to be made for two separate systems. Maybe that's the answer. Two separate systems, at least Māori control over Māori things is a starting point. Whether that's true for the whole judicial system, I don't know, but it's where Moana was coming from.
We've just got, thanks Oliver, we've just got time for a couple of questions if anyone's got anything they'd like to ask. I'll bring you the microphone over.
Can I ask both of you, my name's Colin Fraser, can I ask both of you what your responses would be or reaction would be to the report that came out, that Chester Burrows Task Force?
I'm not sufficiently briefed on that to answer. I'm not too sure what Chester Burrows' conclusions were. Do you? T?
Yeah, I think it's a set of values that we should be using to transform the justice system. For those who haven't read it, He Waka Roimata and Turiki are two reports written by people like Tracy McIntosh and Chester Burrows, which reconceptualises what our justice system could look like without the failed system of imprisonment, effectively. I think it's a very promising blueprint, more a set of values than a blueprint. Yeah.
Time for one more question at the back.
Yeah, thanks. I'd like to. There's a lot of things that have gone through my mind in all of this, but it does strike me that the old questions that you were talking about before about class and race, in addressing this situation with the treaty, will only answer part of the problem, because whatever happens in the end, you're still left with the class problem. And how do you see that being addressed? Because I do believe that within both systems, you may well find that the class one, I know that before I came here for 20 years, or 22 years, I witnessed similar sorts of problems going on in a very monocultural society, but they were about power and about class. And I think they'll still exist here, whatever.
Well, I think there's no doubt class and race will always, those issues will always coexist. I mean, I don't think if you deal with the racism of the system that necessarily you'll deal with the class issues as well. I don't think so. But I have always believed that class was not the reason for the discriminations that we were noticing in the judicial system. I mean, race was a powerful factor, but class added to it, if you like, and the two could, or seldom could be separated.
We've run out of time there, but I'd just like to, I'll take my mask off. I'd just like to come back to the words I used at the beginning about powerful and precise, which is what we've had tonight. Thank you, Oliver. It's been incredibly powerful, but also incredible precision in terms of the figures, the data presented. And I can see why Martin Finley got very angry, because there was nothing he could say. I mean, the evidence is so incontrovertible. Thanks, T, for your response too. That really added another layer in terms of looking at where things are now. And plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. It feels very much that things are continuing. So thank you very much to both of you. Oliver's book is for sale, $20. If you've got $20, we'll be selling copies just at the back of the room there. And I'd like to ask Jerry to finish with a karakia. Jerry, are you...
This particular karakia is a kaitahu one. Kia puri a tātou I te hau o āraki. Kia titiro iho tātou ki te awateri o Waitaki. Kia mau tātou te korowai o kaitahu whānui. Tūia ki te rangi, tūia ki te whenua, tūia ki te nākau o ngā tangata, te hei mauri ora.
Kia ora. Thank you, everyone.